an especially happy start for our lecture series. This is a spring term lecture series in 2023, our first meeting. And so you are the first speaker, guest speaker to open this term of the lectures. We're very pleased. Professor, just a very brief introduction of Professor Yong Huang. He is currently professor and chairperson of the Department of Philosophy at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and also editor-in-chief of one of the most prestigious journals in comparative philosophy, Tao, a journal of comparative philosophy, and also editor-in-chief of Tao Companions to Chinese Philosophy. He is the author of several books, written both in Chinese and in English, and also author of more than 100 journal papers. Also, he writes journal papers both in Chinese and in English. Let me just name at least one of your, actually two. I'd like to mention two of your books: on Religious Goodness and Political Rightness, and Confucius, A Guide for the Perplexed, and also Why Be Moral? Learning from the Neo-Confucianist Chan brothers. So thank you so much for having accepted our invitation. And today the talk will be about agent-focused moral realism. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Docini, for this very nice introduction. And it's my great pleasure to share some ideas with you. The topic that I'm going to discuss today is from one of my forthcoming papers. The paper will be published in Australian Philosophical Review, I think scheduled for 2024. This is quite a kind of strange or interesting format because this paper will be followed by quite a few, I think 4 invited comments and 4 comments from open call, and then I'm also supposed to respond to them. So it's good to try these ideas here, and I would love to hear your criticism comments, help me to respond to the other commentators' questions. So the paper is quite long, and so I kind of just picked some from the paper. If any of you after the talk, if you're interested in the paper, let me know. I can share it with you, or even I can share it with the on the through Zoom, but we'll do it later. Even though I just picked a few passages, it may still be quite long. So I think perhaps it will save some time if I mostly read through the slide. I think since you will see the slide, I think it also it's not I think it's easy for you to follow. So moral realism is normally considered to consist of 2 theses. First thesis has 2 components. A, moral propositions can be true or false. And B, at least some of them are true. And the second proposition is that their truth depends upon moral properties or facts that are mind independent in a relevant sense. By affirming the first part of the first premise is to distinguish moral realism, distinguish itself from moral non-cognitivism, a view that moral propositions are expressions of emotion in disguise, and thus do not have truth value, because emotion cannot be true or false. By affirming second part of the first premise, moral realism distinguishes itself from moral error theory, according to which moral propositions are describing things that do not exist and thus can never be true. That's why I call it moral error theory. And by affirming the second premise, moral realism distinguishes itself from moral subjectivism, claiming that the truth of propositions is mind-dependent. So there are different kinds of moral realism according to a well-known distinction. There are naturalistic moral realism regarding moral properties and effects as natural properties and effects. Natural properties and effects are the property effects that we can use the normal cognitive faculties to study, like science, right? Study the nature. And non-naturalistic moral realism regarding them as regarding moral properties and effects as non-natural properties and effects. So moral properties and effects are not the things that we can use empirical science or natural science to study, because they are not natural properties. According to a lesser known, if not entirely new, and I think perhaps it's entirely new because I think I'm the first person who used this distinction classification. So according to a lesser known, if not entirely new classification, crucial to this talk though, there are action-focused moral realism, primarily concerned with the moral properties of rightness and the wrongness of the action. Okay, so moral realism is about moral properties or moral facts, and action-focused moral realism is primarily concerned with the moral properties of rightness and the wrongness of action, which is in contrast to agent-focused moral realism, taking the moral properties of the goodness and the badness of an agent or a person as its primary concern. So the difference is about rightness and the wrongness of an action, and goodness and badness of the agent. So combining these two different classifications, we may have 4 different types of moral realism. 1, non-naturalistic action-focused moral realism. 2, non-naturalistic agent-focused moral realism. 3, naturalistic action-focused moral realism. And 4, the naturalistic agent-focused moral realism. So in this talk, I'm going to defend the last one, the naturalistic agent-focused moral realism. Why? Because I have not found a truly satisfactory version of non-naturalistic moral realism, whether it's action-focused or agent-focused. Largely because it can only tell us what moral properties and facts are not natural facts, not natural ones, but does not tell us what they are. Even when it appears to tell us something positive about non-naturalistic moral properties and facts, such as they are like mathematical properties. What they essentially tell us is still negative, as the only similarity they show us between moral properties and mathematical properties is that they are not the natural ones. So that's why I would not adopt the non-naturalist, 2 versions of non-naturalistic moral realism, whether it's agent-focused or action-focused. So I'm interested in naturalistic moral realism, but as we mentioned, naturalistic moral realism can have 2 different kinds. One is action-focused, one is agent-focused. Naturalistic action-focused moral realism, however, faces some apparently insurmountable difficulties, which may partially explain not only why there are more moral anti-realists, but also why some moral realists go non-naturalistic. And in the paper, I kind of like discuss the four main objections or main problems with action-focused naturalistic moral realism. Basically, like David Hume's classical issue about how to derive out from yes, and G. Moore's famous kind of like argument about open question argument. And then there are other two, basically from John Mackey's argument from queerness and argument from relativity. But just for you to have some idea, I mentioned only like say something about the like a third one I just mentioned about the queerness. John Mackey argues that the moral properties conceived as properties in actions, that means rightness and wrongness of the action, are very queer in both metaphysical and epistemological senses. Metaphysically, if we say that A's action of beating B has a pain-causing property, we do not find such a property strange or queer at all. But if we say that this action, A's beating B, also has a wrong-making property, we will find such a property very strange and queer. Similarly, if we say that X's action of providing food to the starving person Y has a pain-relieving or pleasure-enhancing property, we do not find such a property strange or queer at all. But if we say that this action also has a right-making property, we will find it strange or queer. Why is it queer? John Mackey says that because if it is a moral property, then it is not only descriptive, but it also has normativity in it, right? And so he finds a natural property that is both objective and normative, or use his term, objective prescriptivity. He thinks that is incomprehensible. So that is metaphysical queerness. Epistemologically, Mackey claims that we can know whether an action has a pain-causing or pleasure-enhancing property by our moral way of knowing things, by our normal way of knowing things. But clearly, we cannot use our normal way of knowing things to perceive whether an action has a right-making or wrong-making property. When we see, suppose A's action of beating B, we can see this action has the pain-causing property, but we will not be able to use our normal faculty to see, oh, there is actually wrongness in the action. So that's so in order to know that, perhaps we need to have some like a sixth sense or something, some other cognitive faculty that we do not have to know the wrongness or rightness kind of property of the action. So that's the reason I want to kind of defend and argue for the naturalistic, agent-focused moral realism. Although no one, as far as I know, has clearly advocated such a brand of moral realism. Indeed, as I mentioned, the very distinction between the action-focused and agent-focused naturalistic moral realism itself is new. It's closely related to virtue ethics, which is also primarily concerned with the goodness and the badness of a person, and not the rightness and the wrongness of action. In this sense, virtue ethics is in contrast to other two normative ethical theories, deontology and consequentialism, because both these two types of normative theory are concerned about rightness and the wrongness of action. And that also explains why contemporary metaphysics, when they talk about moral realism, they always talk about action-focused moral realism, because like in modern time, deontology and consequentialism are dominating normative theory. Since the moral properties that are agent-focused naturalistic moral realism argues to be objective are the goodness and the badness of an agent. It helps us to see what contemporary virtue essayists aim to convey when they emphasize that good and bad are attributive adjective rather than predicative adjective. The distinction between attributive adjective and predicative adjective. A distinction first made by Peter Geach in a paper, Good and Evil, a paper sadly neglected according to Philippa Foot. One way to tell whether an adjective is attributive or predicative, Geach says, is to see in X is an AB, where A is an adjective and B is a noun. So in X is an AB, whether A and B can also separately serve as predicates of X in the form of X is A and X is B. So according to Geach, if A can be separated, this adjective can be separated from the noun it is connected with and serve as a predicate of X, then this A is a predicative adjective. And if not, it is an attributive one. Now, this is kind of like a abstract. So let's use an example. In X is a red book. Red, of course, is an adjective. Red can be separated from book so that we can say X is red without knowing what X is, as well as X is a book. So here, red is a predicative adjective because red can be used as a predicate of X independent of the book. In contrast, in X is a small elephant. Small is also an adjective, right? The small cannot be separated from the noun elephant, as we cannot meaningfully say that X is small without knowing what X is, although we can still say X is an elephant. So if we do not know what X is, we really cannot say X is small. We see a thing and we don't know it is elephant, right? And we cannot say it's small. Maybe if we know it's elephant, it's small elephant in comparison with other elephant, right? But if we don't know what it is, we cannot say it's small because it's a lot bigger than an ant. However small the elephant is, it would be much bigger than ant, right? So that means the small, this adjective, cannot be used as a predicate of X if we don't know what this X is. To illustrate this, Peter Geach compares a red car and a good car. Okay, since here we are talking about good or bad, right? So before we apply the term good and bad to human beings, we can see how it is used in the car. So, and try to see whether good and bad is attributive adjective or predicative adjective. If there is a red car, for example, in distance, one person can see its color, but cannot see what it is. And another person is colorblinded, but otherwise has a better eyesight, and so can see it is a car. So one of them says that it is red, and another says that it is a car. And then combining these two different informations, we can affirm it is a red car. This shows that red can be a predicate of the thing that is red independently of the thing that is red, and thus is a predicative adjective. That means when the person sees the thing in distance, he can say this is red without knowing what is red, right? And in this case, red is a predicative adjective, not attributive adjective. In contrast, the same thing cannot be said about a good car. According to Peter Gitch, there is no such possibility of ascertaining a thing is a good car by putting independent information that it is good and that it is a car. For example, if something is in distance and one person say it is a car, but I don't know whether it's good or not. I think that's reasonable. So, I know it's a car, but I don't know whether it's good or bad. But another person say, I know it is good, but I don't know if it's a car or not. The second person is unreasonable, right? If you don't know what it is, how can you say it's good or bad, right? But you can know what it is without knowing it's good or bad, right? So this is because while it is possible for one person to know that something is a car without knowing that it is good, it's impossible for anyone to know that it is good without knowing what it is. So Gitch's discussion of good, and then of course also bad, as an attributive adjective is significant to the agent-focused moral realism. On the one hand, the basic moral property this type of moral realism is concerned with is precisely the good of the agent as a human being, in contrast to action-focused moral realism, which is primarily concerned with the moral property of rightness of an action. On the other hand, Gitch's emphasis on the inseparability between the meaning of such terms and the nature of the thing such terms are applied to, and on the descriptive function of such terms, underscores that good is an objective moral property, since the goodness of acts is derived from the nature of acts, which is objective and can be known in objective and even scientific way, assuming X is something in the natural world. So although usually when we say something is good, something is bad, we are using the term in the normative sense, in the evaluative sense, right? But how can we determine whether something is good or not good without knowing the nature of the thing, right? But the nature of the thing is objective, right? And the goodness and the badness of the thing is determined by the nature of the thing, right? So in this sense, goodness is an objective moral property. So in order to determine whether a particular human being is good or bad, we first needed to know what a human being is. And what a human being is an objective issue. Now, people might disagree, right? Some people give this definition of a human being, another person might give a different definition. But precisely what a human being is just like what a dog is, right? What an oak tree is. That is an objective issue. It's not like, okay, you can think this way, I can think the other way, right? There must be some objective criteria to determine what something is. So in this sense, goodness and badness are objective property of the thing. So here, I'm going to get back to like a Zhu Xi, a Neo-Confucian philosopher in the Song Dynasty. So in this talk, I shall argue that Zhu Xi is a moral realist, and he also takes a virtue ethics approach to moral realism. In my paper itself, I first discussed the Aristotelian and Neo-Aristotelian approach because they are also virtue ethics and try to show what kind of problem they have. And here, because of the time constraint, I will not talk about Aristotelian and Neo-Aristotelian. When I talk about Neo-Aristotelian, I'm mostly talking about Rosalind Hursthaus's kind of view of virtue ethics. So I will go directly to Zhu Xi's kind of version. So in other words, Zhu Xi is primarily concerned with the goodness of a person and not the rightness of action. So the central issue of virtue ethics is how to determine the goodness of a person, and the central issue of moral realism based on virtue ethics is how to determine the objectivity of the goodness as a moral quality or moral property. To know whether a particular human being is good or bad, we need to know what a human being is. And this is related to the conception of human nature. If human nature is X, then a good human being is one in whom X is fully manifested. And a bad human being is one in whom X is deficient. In his discussion of human nature, that means what is the thing that makes human beings human, commenting on the saying in the mentions that what is called benevolence 人 is humanity, 人 by the human, 人者人也. So she states that benevolence is the principle that makes human beings human. When discussing the same saying with his students, he further states that the reason that humans are humans is simply that they possess benevolence. To speak of benevolence without speaking of humans is to lose sight of the place where the principle of benevolence resides. And to speak of humans without speaking of benevolence is to regard humans as nothing but a pile of flesh and blood. So for Zhu Xi, the virtue of benevolence is what makes humans human. Without benevolence, one is a deficient human, a human in name only, a human that is not much different from being, or even not a human at all. So here Zhu Xi explains why we ought to have virtue of benevolence by saying that it is constitutive of human nature. Although benevolence is only one of the four cardinal virtues in Confucianism, Zhu Xi sometimes considers it to be a complete virtue that includes other three. Thus, in his essay on benevolence, 人说, Zhu Xi states that although the virtue of heart-mind is all-comprehensive and thoroughgoing, with nothing not included, one Chinese character can denote it, that is benevolence. The virtue of human heart-mind consists of the four: benevolence, rightness, propriety, and wisdom, with benevolence including all. Since the virtue of benevolence, including rightness, propriety, and wisdom, is constitutive of human nature on the one hand, so she can say that human nature possesses virtues, is virtuous, and is thus a virtuous nature, that is 德性. Maybe I skip the quotation in this part. On the other hand, so she can claim that the virtue of benevolence, including rightness, propriety, and wisdom, is the virtue belonging to human nature. And that's why he calls it 性之德, right? And I will also quote skip the quotation. Now the question is, how do we know that human nature consists of such virtues as benevolence, rightness, propriety, and wisdom? In appearance, Zhu Xi fails to show this. In his view, in contrast to qi, which is physical, or kind of like a 形而下, human nature consists of virtues, is metaphysical, 形而上. By being metaphysical, literally above form, Zhu Xi means that human nature is inherently without form. It's not something that can be reached by our eyes and ears, and is not manifested in shape and materials. Although human nature is beyond the reach of our sense perception, Zhu Xi thinks that we can still have an objective knowledge that human nature consists of these four virtues. In this regard, he develops two interrelated arguments, both of which are what I have called elsewhere the explanatory argument. there are empirical things about human beings observable by everyone. So it's physical, not metaphysical. And there must be something to explain that, why human beings have such kind of thing. And this kind of something is what Zushi calls human nature. So human nature is a concept he uses to explain the things that we can experience in human beings. The first, I just mentioned, he develops two different ways, different arguments. The first is what like a contemporary Confucian, Liu Suxian, calls the method of seeking the origin from its current. He says, Zushi always thinks that human nature is not something issued out and is formless, and thus cannot be grasped by any direct method. We have to start from what is already issued and trace it back in order to know the original state of human nature. What he means by what is issued is basically human emotions. So you have human nature and human emotion. Human nature is metaphysical. We cannot know it directly, but human emotions are empirical that we can experience. So from human emotions, we can know the human nature. And that is what Liu Suxian calls the method of seeking the origin, human nature, from its current human emotions. And this is what Zushi says himself. He says, everything has its root. Although the principle of human nature is formless, what issues from it is perceivable. So from the feeling of commiseration, this is one thing that is issued from human nature. So from feeling of commiseration, we know that there must be benevolence. From the feeling of shame and dislike, we know there must be rightness. From the feeling of reverence, we know that there must be propriety. And from the feeling of approving and disapproving, we know that there must be wisdom. If there is originally no principle inside, how can there be sprouts outside? From the sprouts issued outside, we can indisputably know that there must be principle inside. So he uses analogy, right? Suppose when we see a sprout above the ground, although we cannot see what is under the ground, but since there is a sprout above the ground, we can infer that there must be a root underneath it. Otherwise, you will not have the sprout. And so the same thing from the human emotions issued out that we can experience. We can determine there must be something inside, which is human nature. Although human nature is something we cannot experience directly, but from the emotions that we can experience, we can know there must be human nature, corresponding human nature inside. So that is his view, this kind of analogy as just mentioned. Although we cannot see the root underground, in order to explain the bud above the ground that we can see, we know that it must have root underground. So by analogy into his view, although we cannot have direct knowledge of human nature, we can still have indirect knowledge that human nature possesses virtues and is constituted by benevolence, rightness, propriety, and wisdom, because we have the direct knowledge of good emotions issued out from human nature. In order to conclude that human nature is completely good or virtuous, this way, however, we have to assume that all human feelings or emotions are good. And if so, there would not be bad human beings or bad people, which is, of course, counterfactual, and it is also something that Zushi denies. But although Zushi claims that human nature is completely good, he also says that human emotions can be either good or bad. The human nature, he says, issued out is feeling. There are good feelings and there are bad feelings, while human nature is fully good. Now, if we can infer that human nature is good from good feelings issued from it, why can't we infer that human nature is bad from bad feelings issued from it. Since Zuxi think that issued from human nature, you can have both good feelings and bad feelings, right? I skipped something. So in my view, kind of like in this case, I disagree with like Chen Lai. I tried to say something in the previous slide, but I will skip it. There is an asymmetry in response to the question. There is an asymmetry in two senses between good feelings and bad feelings, or moral feelings and immoral feelings in Zuxi's view. In the first sense, from the bud above the ground, we can infer that there must be root underground. But we cannot infer that there must be no root underground simply because there is no bud above the ground. Maybe the root has not grown the bud yet, right? So the root may still be there. And from the healthy bud above the ground, we can infer that there must be healthy root underground. But from a deficient bud above the ground, we cannot infer that its root underground must also be deficient because the bud may be become bad because some human beings, kind of step on it or something, right? Similarly, from the good feeling or moral feelings, we can infer that human nature from which this feeling is issued out must be good. But from the bad feelings, we cannot infer that human nature from which this feeling is issued out must be bad. But this argument from asymmetry, of course, is still limited. Although from the bad bud, we may not infer that its root must also be bad. Still, we cannot exclude the possibility that the bud is bad indeed because the root is bad. Similarly, although we cannot infer that human nature must be bad simply because human feeling issued out from it is bad, we cannot exclude the possibility that the feeling is bad indeed because the human nature is bad. So here we have to examine the second sense of asymmetry that Zuxi is talking about. This is the asymmetry, again, between good feeling and bad feeling, good emotion and bad emotion. In Zuxi's view, the good feelings are natural and thus immediate, while the bad feelings are artificial or calculated and thus mediated. This is best seen in his comments on the following famous passage in Mencius 2a6. I think everyone is familiar with that. But since it's related to the argument, some kind of special emphasis in it. Let me just read this passage from Mencius. Everyone has a heart mind that cannot bear to see others suffer, which can be illustrated in such a scenario. When suddenly seeing an infant about to fall into a well, everyone will have the heart mind feeling alarmed, distressed, and commiserated. And this is so not because they want to gain the favor from the child's parents, nor to seek praise from their neighbors and friends, nor to be dislike having a bad reputation. So in his collected commentary on this passage, Zuxi emphasized the immediacy of such a feeling. He says they immediately have the feeling upon suddenly seeing it, or the lack of mediation by anything artificial. The feeling, he says, does not arise from any of the three things mentioned. More importantly, it is also clearly Zuxi's view that the natural and immediate feeling is genuine and reflects human nature. As immediately after his own comment above on the Mencius passage, he quotes the following passage from another Neo-Confucian, Xie Liangzu, a student of the 10 brothers. And Xie Liangzu says, it is important to know that the genuine heart mind, right? So, what is genuine? What is artificial? It is important to know the genuine heart mind as soon as one suddenly sees the infant about to fall into a well, one's heart mind feels alarm and distress. This is genuine heart mind. It's not something one gets after reflection or exercise of the willpower. It is something natural, consistent with the heavenly law. In contrast, if one does so in order to gain favor from the parents, seek praises from neighbors and friends, or dislike having a bad reputation, it's due to the selfish human desires, which is not genuine human heart mind. So when discussing this Mencius passage with his students, in addition to being natural, immediate, and genuine, Zuxi also stresses a related feature of such good feeling. They are not within one's control. He says, as soon as one sees the infant about to fall into well, the feeling of commiseration arises in the person. How can one refrain from having it? In contrast, things that are arranged by human efforts are what humans can refrain from doing. Things that are natural are what humans cannot refrain from doing. So good feelings are the feelings you will naturally have. You cannot control it. Finally, Zuxi emphasized that such good feelings are feelings that everyone, without exception, will have in circumstances. This is because, this is of course already made clear in the original passage from the Mencius. Everyone will have the feeling of the alarm, distress, and commiseration upon seeing the infant about to fall into a well. But Zuxi wants to emphasize that this everyone also includes bad people, people with bad feelings. So in a letter to Zhang Junfu, after quoting the Mencius passage we have been discussing, Zuxi immediately quotes a passage from the Great Learning, saying, when alone an inferior person does bad things without limit, so bad persons. But upon seeing a superior person, they immediately feel awkward. That is a good feeling, right? So, so what he is trying to show is that, when Mencius says everyone will have such a kind of feeling upon seeing a child about to fall into well, that also includes bad human beings. So in the above, we have shown one aspect of Zuxi's view of human nature, and try always to keep in mind why we discuss human nature, because we want to see when we say whether a human person, whether a person is a good person or bad person, we have to decide how to determine whether the person is good or not. And in order to determine that, we need to know what a human being is, right? And that is related to human nature. So we have shown one aspect to Zuxi's view of human nature, that is all human beings have benevolence, rightness, propriety, and wisdom as their nature, as the constituent parts of their nature. There is another aspect of his argument, however, that is only humans have such nature. And this is the goal of his second argument, which is centered around the distinction between human beings, particularly bad human beings, and animals. It's true, as we have seen, that Zuxi holds the general Confucian view that bad human beings, the human beings who have abandoned what distinguishes human beings from animals, are no different from birds and beasts. The passage quoted below is basically indicates this is Zuxi's view, so I kind of skip that, try to save a little bit of time. At the same time, however, Zuxi observes another empirical fact and aims to explain it. This fact is this: vicious human beings are, after all, still different from birds and beasts. Although sometimes he says, bad human beings are no different from birds and beasts. But after all, he realized that they're still different from birds and beasts. That is why we say it's different, because we criticize bad human beings, claiming that they ought not to be vicious, but ought to be virtuous. But we do not criticize birds and bees, saying that, with the same behavior as vicious, claiming that they ought not to be vicious, but ought to be virtuous. Why? Ought implies can. Vicious people can be made virtuous, but birds and bees cannot be made virtuous. That is another kind of empirical fact he wants to kind of explain. So this fact that even most evil people can be made virtuous, but birds and bees cannot acquire the human virtue is not that much disputable. Even today, when we know more things about other regarding behaviors of some non-human animals. So she provides an explanation of this fact, why even most vicious people can still be made virtuous, but vicious animals cannot be made virtuous. She says, qi can be either one-sided or straight, either open or blocked, either clear or turbid, either pure or impure. Among living things, those whose qi is straight and open are human beings, and those whose qi is one-sided and blocked are animals. Among human beings, those whose qi is clear and pure are sages and worthies, and those whose qi is turbid and impure are stupid and unworthy. Here, Zhu Xi not only explains the distinction between human beings and non-human beings, but also the distinction between virtuous human beings and vicious human beings. Although both distinctions are explained in terms of different qualities of qi, the former lies in the qi's being straight and open, or one-sided and blocked, while the latter lies in the qi's being clear and pure, or turbid and impure. We can see now that when Zhu Xi says that vicious people are no different from animals, he is referring to their actual states lacking human virtues. But when he says that vicious people, just like virtuous people, are still different from animals, he is referring to the inherent states. Vicious people can be made virtuous, while animals cannot. Since ought implies can, we can say that vicious people ought to be virtuous, but we cannot say animals ought to be virtuous. For this reason, Zhu Xi states that while ancient sages stress the importance of moral cultivation of human beings, we do not do the same thing to animals. We do not do the moral cultivations of animals. And here is an interesting passage. I kind of maybe want to kind of read it because this is not quite a common passage. Usually people, I think, don't discuss this, so let me just read that. He wants to show that, we do not do the moral cultivation of animals, but we do moral cultivations of even the most vicious people, most vicious human beings. He says, as animals are endowed with one-sided qi, there is no way to open it, and thus there is no need for moral education of them. To fully realize the nature of animals is to treat them appropriately in light of what they are capable of understanding. What they can understand is what they are good at, and sages make use of what they are good at. For example, we can still ride on a violent horse with a whip, but that is all that we can do with the animals. This may also be considered as a kind of cultivation, which is to use them according to the heavenly principle manifested in them. Regarding wolves and tigers that want to eat human beings, we do not do moral cultivation, right? We can either trap them, kill them, or chase them away, right? So for animals that may cause harm to human beings, we do not do moral cultivations of them. We just either trap them or kill them or chase them away. But for bad human beings, we do not do the same thing. We do not trap them, kill them, or chase them away. We try to do moral cultivations of them. Well, at least in addition to maybe we sometimes also, kind of like put them, in some place, right? So that they cannot kill human beings. But we still do the moral cultivation of it. So we have earlier asked whether Zuxi's conception of human nature as consisting of virtues of benevolence, rightness, propriety, and wisdom is merely a normative one, implying that every human being ought to have these virtues, or also an objective one, implying that this is actually what distinguishes human beings from non-human beings. If Zuxi is a moral realist, he has to provide arguments to show that his conception of human nature is objective as well as normative. Now, its normativity is clear, so less clear is about objectivity, and that is like something that I have spent most of time to discuss. Indeed, Zuxi provides two interrelated and mutually supporting arguments. I just summarizing. On the one hand, using the method of seeking the origin from the current, he argues that in order to explain the feeling of commiseration, shame and dislike, modesty and complacence, approving and disapproving that we can observe all human beings have, we must assume that all human beings also have the corresponding virtues of benevolence, rightness, propriety, and wisdom as their nature, human nature. On the other hand, although we can observe that at least some people also have bad feelings, there are two mutually exclusive ways to explain it. One is to assume that there is a bad human nature from which these bad feelings are issued. The other is to deny that there is a bad human nature corresponding to bad human beings, bad human feelings, and maintain that bad feelings also come from good human nature. The reason such feelings coming from good human nature is bad is that there is some additional element involved in the process of issuing of human feelings from human nature. As we have seen, Zuxi adopts the second way to explain the origin of bad feelings, which, if successful, exclude the first way. The key to this explanation is the distinction between humans and animals. An empirically observable fact is that even the most vicious persons can be made virtuous, while animals cannot. And for this reason, in all times and cultures, we emphasize the importance of moral cultivation or moral education to human beings, but not to animals. Similarly, when a human being does some vicious things, we condemn them, thinking that the person ought not to do that. But when an animal does the same thing, we do not condemn it and do not say that it ought not to do it. This shows that human nature as something distinguishing human beings from non-human beings must possess virtues of benevolence, rightness, propriety, and wisdom that animals do not have. And thus, when such virtues are obscured by turbid chi and selfish desires in some human beings, we regard them as deficient human beings, bad human beings, right? Because we know what human being is. Human being is the being that is consists of this benevolence, rightness, propriety, and wisdom. So when they do not have that, then they are bad human beings. Okay, so we regard them as deficient human beings, unhealthy human beings, or human beings in name only, while we do not say the same thing to animals. The reason is that although neither deficient human beings nor animals possess virtues, deficient human beings can be made virtuous, while animals cannot. Should human nature, at least the nature of vicious human beings, just like animals, does not originally possess virtue of benevolence, rightness, propriety, and wisdom, then we will not be able to explain why even the most vicious human beings can be made good, while non-human animals can't. In other words, since non-human animals cannot be made virtuous because their nature is not virtuous, then if human nature is not virtuous, then humans cannot be made virtuous either, which, however, is counterfactual. For this reason, we have to assume that the nature of vicious human beings, just like that of virtuous human beings, is is virtuous. In short, Zhuxi's first argument shows that human nature is what all humans can have, while his second argument shows that human nature is what only humans can have, right? And so if humans are humans because of their possessing benevolence, rightness, propriety, and wisdom, this is four things that are distinguishing mark of being human. If we know that, then when we try to evaluate a particular human being, whether this human being is a good human being or bad human being, as we mentioned at the very beginning, in order to know whether something is good or not, we need to know what this something is. And this something is a human being. And what a human being is a being that has this distinguishing mark of benevolence, etc. Right? So a good human being is a human being who possesses these four kind of virtues, and bad human beings is when these four virtues are missing, right? So this is, in this sense, we can say Zhuxi's kind of like a view is a moral realist kind of view. I mentioned that there are some objections to moral realism, and I mentioned that, like in my paper, I discussed the four main objections to moral realism. Although at the beginning I only mentioned one, and saying that the kind of like a moral realism, action-based or action-focused moral realism cannot deal with such kind of issue. And in my paper, at the last section of my paper, I try to show how Zhuxi's version of agent-focused moral realism can avoid this problems, the four problems. Originally, when I prepared this slide, I also kind of try to just use an example about queerness, how Zhuxi's kind of moral realism, his conception of objective goodness and badness of human being can respond to the issue of queerness. But I realize that kind of like we do not have much time to left. So perhaps I just stop here. And if like you have some questions that will touch upon the things that I haven't had time to discuss, then I can revisit. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Huang. This was a very well-articulated presentation, and your proposal for agent-based naturalist realism is also very, very interesting. Let's see if we have questions from the venue or from those that are participating on Zoom. Those that are on Zoom, you can maybe raise your virtual hand or write your name in the chat box. Maybe I shall change my position to check the chat box. Yeah, I think you have a question.
Yes.
Okay, so maybe we can start.
Hello, Huang, Yong. Thank you.
Hey, Gil, yeah, nice meeting you here.
Thank you very much for the presentation. As Nivia already said, and as expected, very clear. And actually, I find it also entirely convincing how you describe Zhuxi's position. That was, I think it's a very good way of describing Zhuxi's position in contemporary terminology, and I have no objection to that. I just have one, what seems to me an obvious thing that seems to be wrong with Zhuxi's position, namely his main assumption. I just listened for some other reasons recently to a lot of YouTube lectures by the American biologist Robert Sapolsky. And he has all this research showing that vicious people cannot be morally educated. That's kind of entirely impossible because of all kinds of biological and social reasons. So that seems to be a major problem. Again, like I do not disagree to the slightest with your characterization of Zhuxi's position. But it seems that from a contemporary perspective, we understand that this basic promise that vicious people can be morally educated seems to be very problematic, or actually wrong from a scientific perspective.
Thank you so much, Gil, for this very kind of interesting and actually very kind of important question. I assume, like a social biologist or you're quoting from, or even psychologist you're quoting from. I think, and kind of correct me if I understand it wrong. I don't think that they are saying that vicious people, non-vicious people can be made good, but only some, what is called like a sociopath or psychopath, right? Because obviously, kind of some, I think they would say non-vicious people can be made vicious. I think that is certainly counterfactual. So assuming this case, they're only referring to those people like sociopaths or psychopaths, right? And again,
Just to clarify,
yeah,
they cannot be morally educated, right? You can somehow, whatever, change their brain chemistry or whatsoever, or you can throw them in jail and prevent them from doing bad things, and you can give them whatever medication and whatever, right? But it's not really possible by teaching them Confucianism and telling them about the analects to treat them. It's not very effective.
no, I think like the moral education, of course, you kind of like you do not have to use kind of analects to educate them, right? You can use the kind of like Aristotle's ethics or Bible to educate them anyway, like the moral education, right? I think it would be too radical, at least from my point of view. I think like we have numerous examples, people can do some bad things and they learn from it. And later become good people, right? If like they claim that no bad people can become good in any way, actually put them into jail, like excuse me, like Confucianism does not exclude that, and they may regard that is also a way of moral education, because like someone is going to do bad things. You need to first put them into jail, right? And then followed by some kind of moral education, right? So I think it would be too radical and I don't think it's true because we just have so many examples who, like maybe in their first half of life they're bad people, and the second half of life they're good people, right? So either kind of like a self-cultivation or cultivation by others, right? I think so they can be made good. But I think what is like more like acceptable, and certainly like Confucius or even Zuxi, perhaps they are not aware of that. What we today call the sociopaths and the psychopaths, and this is the issue. I think today, because Confucius 2,000 years ago, like Zuxi 1,000 years ago, they don't know anything about that, right? But today, if we are still talking about Confucianism, then perhaps we need to deal with such kind of issue, right? But like from my point of view, this is the kind of issue that is not, it's kind of like quite tricky, but it's not kind of like saying that then we have to abandon the Confucian view, right? Because when we talk about the distinction between human beings and non-human beings, and this is just like Aristotle's view, when we do that, it's not like when we do the math, it's very kind of precise, right? There is a very clear boundary, right? On this side are human beings, on the other side, non-human beings. There are some kind of beings on the border, right? And they may look like a human being, or they may look like animals. So perhaps, like most altruistic animals may be more like real human beings than least kind of most vicious human being, and we're like a psychopath, right? So we can acknowledge that, and this in any case, if we limit this situation to sociopaths and psychopaths, that is not kind of majority, right? When we talk about moral issues, I think like we have some kind of moral issues with some people. Most cases, we are not dealing with the sociopaths and the psychopaths. We are dealing with people like we think that they ought not to do that, right? Because if a person is psychopath and sociopath, then we really cannot say, hey, you ought not to do this, because he cannot not to do that, right? But in our common kind of situation, when someone did bad, and I think this person, in most cases, the person is not a sociopath and a psychopath, in the sense that they can be kind of corrected. They can become a good person, right? Yeah, I don't know, like whether it's a really good question. I have been kind of thinking of that, like how to precisely deal with such kind of issue. The issue that Confucius and Zhu Xi are certainly not aware of, like sociopath, psychopath. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question by James Huang.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, okay, change it.
Yeah, fine. The new year.
Yeah, because when you are in the same room, so many people, it's so small, I cannot recognize who you are.
Okay, I can make because another conference, another meeting. So anyway, thank you very much for this very interesting and to some extent, it's very traditional. I mean, the discussion of this very important issue, and you try to argue Jewish history as a more realist philosophy, Confucian tradition, and it's quite convincing when we follow this Confucian logic. But I have two small questions. First, the related this you appeal to this distinction. There's a gauge distinction between, let's say, you call the two kinds of adjective, with attributive adjective and the predicative adjective. And could you please compare this distinction with the, let's say, in the John Locke's distinction between primary and secondary quality? Looks like very similar. If we could make such kind of comparison, how do we deal with defense or deal with a criticism against John Locke's distinction? Yeah, or this distinction. That's first question. And second question, of course, when you argue for Zhu Xi, and you mentioned this virtue called benevolence. Looks like it's a very objective, everyone hold it, and all the Confucians will hold it. But even for that, that reminds me about the story in the history, in Chinese history, like Song Xianggong Zhi Ren. Okay, we're talking about benevolence. But even for this, if you claim that as a moral realist, the property. And then today when we see, how do you think about Song Xianggong Zhi Ren, benevolence of the Duke Song? We know this. And even we have another virtue, we may call that trustworthy. And we have another very famous story told us by Zhuangzi. That's a Wei Sen Zhi Xi, the trustness of a guy called Wei Sen, right? He died because he tried to keep the promise when he dating a young girl. So that looks like give us some kind of different kind of evaluation when we have these cases. And also looks like these cases go for the more relativist position. Yeah, how to deal with that? Just two small questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Chinje, for this two questions. First question. You have never thought the relationship between John Locke's distinction between primary quality and secondary qualities, and Peter Gooch's distinction between attributive and predicative adjective. I don't think, at least I think there is no correspondence between these two distinctions. It's not saying, okay, the primary quality is suppose say attributive and secondary quality is predicative. I don't see such a kind of like correspondence. For example, like suppose you're talking about like a square, like the shape of the thing, right? The shape of the thing, according to John Locke, is primary quality, right? And that is like suppose something is square. From Peter Gooch's distinction, the square is a predicative adjective, in the sense that I can say something is square in shape, even though I don't know what it is, right? So that means the primary quality, at least I haven't gone through all the primary quality, but I think I just try to show one example of primary quality and one example of secondary quality. Actually, secondary quality, when I talk about red is secondary quality, right? And red is also a predicative adjective, because you can know something is red without knowing what the thing is. And attributive adjective, for example, like good and bad, or small and big. Now, in this case, you may say small or big is a primary quality, right? Small and big are primary qualities. And so you can find some primary qualities that are can be described by attributive adjective, but you can also have some primary quality, as I just mentioned, shape, like the square, that can be described by predicative adjective. So there is no correspondence between primary qualities. So, okay, say all the primary qualities can be described by, suppose to say, attributive adjective, and all the secondary qualities can only be described by predicative adjective. So there is no correspondence. So I think that there are some primary qualities that are attributive adjective, and some primary qualities that are predicative adjective. And the same thing, there are some secondary qualities that are attributive adjective, and some secondary qualities that are predicative. So, but I need to think more. But I have never thought about that. That's a good question. But I just immediately think of that. I think at least there is no correspondence between these two distinctions. Well, the second question, I think you're trying to say that, like, different people may have different conceptions of virtues, right? And then we will kind of like have come to like a different views, different kind of assessment, different evaluation of human beings. Actually, the virtue, or kind of in this sense of vice as well, are human character traits, right? Virtues are good human character traits, and vices are bad human character traits. So in this case, we needed to tell what character traits are good, what character traits are bad. But how can we do that? Because we are talking about the human character traits, right? So we are not talking about the character traits of a cat or dog, right? What is the good character traits of a cat may not be a good character traits of a dog. And what is the good character traits of a cat and a dog may not be good character traits of a human being. So in order for us to determine what is a good character trait, what is a bad character trait, what is a good human, what is virtue, what is vice, we need to know what is a human being, right? So ultimately, in this case, some character traits may be regarded as good, as a virtue by some people. But if we say, is this something distinguishes human beings from other beings? If this is not, then we cannot say this is, say good human nature. Maybe, a good human character traits. Maybe not necessarily saying that is bad either, because maybe animal also has this character traits, right? So ultimately, we still have the objective standard to determine what character traits is good. That means what is virtue, and what character traits is bad. So I think this is it's not saying that okay, some people think this is virtue, some people say it is kind of wise. Different people may disagree on what is virtue, what is wise. But this disagreement is solvable because according to moral realism, because I just mentioned, we have a criteria to determine what character traits virtue, what character traits wise. Virtues are character traits that can distinguish the unique human nature, right? And the vices are the kind of character traits that kind of like you can say takes away the distinguishing mark of being human, right? Yeah, so I think the problem is not different people have different conceptions of virtue, but that is the case. But we need, according to moral realism, we have something. No, I think the more kind of like a serious problem is, of course, what is human nature? What makes human beings human, right? And of course, we all know the Confucian view that I have been talking about, but they are all different views, right? For example, Aristotle thinks that rationality is what makes human beings human. And if we do that, then a good human being is the most rational person, right? And a bad human being is not kind of rational human being, right? So I think then it will comes down to this issue about what kind of human. And actually, according to like, I know this is too complicated. I will not get into that. But I was trying to think about like neo-Aristotelian kind of idea that I discussed in the paper. Hursthouse, she also has a conception of human nature, but she kind of, I think this I agree. We may disagree on what human nature is, but what human nature is, this is an objective issue. She emphasized, and I agree, that the question about what human nature is parallel to what is the nature of an oak tree, or what is the nature of wolf. But suppose we can use science to study the nature of oak tree, or study the nature of wolf or some other animals, then obviously we can also study the nature of human being. Even today, we disagree, just like at a certain time, scientists may disagree on what is the nature of a particular thing, right? But this does not take it away, say, oh, this is merely subjective issue. You can think this way, I can think that way. Because, exactly what a human being is, what makes human beings different from other beings, that is an objective issue. And of course, Confucianism has only one kind of like an answer to it. Maybe the answer not everyone will accept, but I thought this is at least also a good candidate of answering the question, what makes human beings different from non-human beings. Thank you, Chinji, for this very good question. I don't know whether especially that second question, I don't know whether I really answered your question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, it's my turn next. Hello, Huang.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think your paper was extremely ambitious, and especially starting out with this map of basically positions in moral realism. So I have two comments about it, and I want to start with just an issue about the way that you framed the paper right at the outset. So you mentioned several times error theory.
Yes.
And, it struck me that many people would regard error theory as a form of moral realism. So error theory actually presupposes moral realism. In some people's perspective, it's simply that your B at least some of them are true, this is what the error theorists will deny. So if that's the case, then you could be a moral realist only holding A but not B. Now, this doesn't matter at all for your paper, but I thought you were unnecessarily exposing yourself to objections by what you were saying about error theory, but nothing seems to depend on it. So maybe it's not necessary to mention error theory.
Okay.
So the next point, you're trying to argue that Jushi is a naturalistic, agent-focused moral realist. But I think it would be possible to make a case that he's also, or he can be interpreted as a non-naturalistic, agent-focused moral realist. And the reason is, if you look closely and focus on what you were saying about human nature being metaphysical, in other words, non-empirical, then many people would regard that as actually counting as non-natural in the sense in which the word is used in the discourse on moral realism. So it may be that this word nature in the expression human nature is potentially misleading us into thinking that the account therefore must be a form of naturalism, when it's possible that someone like Mackie would say that, well, human nature on Jushi's account is actually pretty queer.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd just like your comments on this.
Thank you so much. It's Professor Harrison, right? Yeah, I kind of like okay, very good questions, both of them. About the first question, about the moral error theory, in the talk today I didn't say much. In the paper I did kind of like didn't go into detail, but at least like quite a few pages talking about the error theory. Now, I don't know whether in what sense people can regard error theory as a kind of moral realism. First of all, my kind of definition, actually here is not my definition. I thought that that's quite common, when people define moral realism. So I think in kind of like a normal situation, I think people usually regard error theory as a non-realism, because error theory essentially, is saying that moral statement or describing things that do not exist, right? And the people kind of often, I think even John Mackey, I think himself, uses the analogy of the theory of phlogiston, right? In the history, people try to explain why there is a phenomena of burning. And then they are saying that there is something that is called phlogiston. And then they develop a lot of theories about phlogiston. But actually people realize that phlogiston really does not exist. So whatever theory you have about this is such kind of substance, such kind of substance, but this substance does not exist at all, right? So that is kind of like whatever theory you have, it's wrong. And so John Mackey, when he talks about the error theory, he is saying that moral, maybe Victoria, I think maybe in this sense people want to say this is a moral realist, because when people make moral judgment, moral statement, they are trying to describe an objective fact or objective kind of property, right? And in this sense, okay, now that's the moral realism. But the theory is saying that they are all wrong. They cannot be right. No one can be right when you make a moral judgment, when you try to describe the moral property, because such kind of property really does not exist, right? So I can understand like only in this sense, in the sense that like people from John Mack's view mistakenly think that they are describing the fact, because the fact this fact does not exist at all, right? And people may have, they describe this way, I describe this way, but since the thing you are trying to, all of you try to describe does not exist, and so whatever description you have, it must be wrong. That's called the error theory, right? So I think from like an error theorist, it's not a kind of object, it's not a realist view. Although, for those people who are trying to make a moral judgment, they think they are describing the objective fact. And but the moral theorists are saying that they are mistaken, right? You are really not describing the fact, because the fact is not there, what they are describing, right? So it's wrong. So I think, I think most people think that error theory is, one kind of anti-moral realism. But of course, that will be, kind of like a classification. On this issue, I do not have any kind of like originality. I think perhaps I just follow the, like the, majority view regarding it as a, not a realism. It's one form of anti-realism. But I think if we kind of like say, because those people who are making the moral judgment think that they are describing the fact, that's why it's kind of like a moral realism. But I still think it's not appropriate, because we are not talking about those people. Because we are talking about kind of like a error theorist. We are talking moral theory, because they think that is they are describing something that does not exist, right? But as long as we can like distinguish the two senses, then I think it's okay whether we call it moral realism or not moral realism. As long as we say, okay, when I say it's moral realism, in the sense that people who are making moral judgments think that they are describing the fact. But when someone says it's anti-realism, they're saying, no, I say it's anti-realism because they are all describing something that does not exist. Right?
Yes, sorry, it's just that according to error theory, if moral statements are true, they would be true in a morally realist sense. So that's the
but according to moral theory, error theory is no judgment can be true. That's why everything is false, because you are describing something that does not exist. It cannot be true. Right? Yeah. Okay, the second question actually is like a more tricky question, because usually when we talk about like natural property and non-natural properties, and when people talk about non-natural properties, usually it's two examples. One is mathematical properties. Mathematical properties are non-natural properties because they are not something that we can study, use like science, right, objectively, right? It's a mathematical property. For example, a triangle has like a 180 degree, right? That's not a natural property. That's a mathematical property, so it's non-natural property. Another way, when you kind of like people say moral properties are non-natural property, they will say no, they are like a mathematical property. They are non-natural. Another way they're saying that they're like a metaphysical property. Metaphysical property is not a natural property. And so Professor Harrison, I think that's why I say, your question is, right to the target, because you said, like when people talk about non-natural property, like moral properties are not non-natural, one of the two main kind of like analogy people use is metaphysical properties. Metaphysical properties are non-natural property. And now you are saying that in Zhuxi's view, the kind of like the like benevolence, etc., human nature is metaphysical. Then how can you say it's naturalistic, right? So that's why I think it's very kind of like a important question. Now, my answer to that, actually kind of wrote a paper. The paper actually finished, I think before I came to Hong Kong. That was like 10 years ago. is collected in a kind of book, but the book is still not published. So actually, like the Chinese version of the book, people translated it. So I make the distinction in this paper between two types of metaphysics. I call it foundationalist metaphysics and explanatory metaphysics. Actually, I referred to that in this paper. So when people say like a natural property, non-natural properties are like a metaphysical property, they're talking about foundationalist properties. That means kind of like a foundationalist metaphysics. That means this is metaphysics established entirely independent of any empirical things, right? They want to first establish a purely metaphysical things and then use this as foundation, as whatever kind of like empirical things or moral things that has to be consistent with that. So this is the foundationalist metaphysics. And I think this is a type of metaphysics that has been criticized in contemporary kind of philosophy. It's, I think, in both analytic tradition and continental tradition, maybe more in analytic tradition. Analytic tradition, they're talking about like a post-metaphysics, after metaphysics. When I'm thinking of continental philosophy, I'm thinking like Jürgen Habermas, right? He has one of his book is post-metaphysical thinking. So I think they are criticizing this foundationalist metaphysics. Now, there is another type of metaphysics. I call it explanatory metaphysics. That means, metaphysics is not independent of empirical things. This metaphysics is purely to explain the empirical things. Why there is such kind of thing, right? And then they kind of like try to explain it and by developing some kind of metaphysical idea. So whether this metaphysical idea is true or not depends upon whether they can explain the empirical thing. And as you may recall, I regard Zhu Xi as an explanatory metaphysician because his conception of human nature is based on human emotion, right? He said, why human beings have such kind of emotion, right? If they do not have such kind of human nature, how can you have such kind of emotion? So this, in this sense, like use the kind of like a term in contemporary metaethics, not metaphysics, metaethics, we may say like, suppose the benevolence, right? This is a kind of one component of human nature in Zhu Xi's view, right? Is natural in this sense, in the sense that it supervenes on the natural thing, right? Itself maybe not natural, but it supervenes on the natural thing. And naturalism, when kind of like a naturalist moral realism, when they claim that moral properties are natural, they are essentially saying that they are either natural properties themselves or supervenes on the natural property. And so I think Zhu Xi's version of moral realism is a view that moral properties themselves are not natural, but they supervenes on the natural properties. And in this sense, it's still naturalistic. So naturalism can be, when we talk about kind of naturalism, when we talk about moral properties, they can either talk about the properties, moral properties, suppose rightness, wrongness, goodness, badness. They say they are themselves are natural. That means we can just study them. We can just use our sense organs or other kind of, eyes or whatever other sense organs could perceive them, right? So that is entirely natural. But the other thing, other properties, they may, you cannot see them, but they supervenes on the natural property. Whenever natural property changes, this also changes, right? Because ultimately, they are not foundational. So in this sense, I don't know, like, whether I have kind of like a, kind of like provided convincing answer to this question or not. I'm still not quite sure because this is an issue. Actually, it's a really good question that I have been, thinking about. Because when I use the term metaphysical, then immediately metaphysical is not natural, right? Because kind of naturalism, non-naturalism, and metaphysics is non-naturalism, right? So Yeah, but at least so far, that is my way kind of like to deal with this issue. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm afraid we already ran out of time, so I'm sorry that there are participants in the Zoom meeting that I think had some questions, Pedro, and
I'm okay if
Fine.
if we can go a few minutes beyond, I'm fine.
So maybe if we managed, I will not ask my question. Also, I was very curious to know what would be the metaphysical status of feelings in Sushi and their relation to the human virtues. But no, please do not address this point. So very quickly, Pedro, I think maybe we can only get one question. That is, I think Pedro was the first to try to, write down his name. So Pedro, we try to stay short, okay?
I'll be very, very quick. Can you hear me, Professor Huang?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. I have many. I'll just ask one question. I wonder how moral cultivation can improve one's chi. Does Jushi explain this question somewhere? How moral cultivation can improve one's poor chi, turbid chi? How can I get a clear chi if I have a turbid chi?
Yeah, I think basically he is talking about purify your chi, right? Because your chi is kind of turbid, impure. You have, and why your chi is impure? Because you have selfish desire, right? And then I didn't go in, because kind of this is not my main focus in this paper, but so that's why I didn't go into detail of this. But then, of course, he developed some other Confucians, developed a lot of kind of the cultivation method. Actually, he talked about quite a few different ones, including, first of all, of course, if someone is bad, there are two different aspects, right? I already mentioned it. One is self-cultivation, right? And one is cultivation, moral education by others. So I'm not perhaps you are interested in both, right? Moral education by others. Then of course, I think Zushi holds the Confucian view. The best way of cultivating other people is to be a moral exemplar by yourself, right? And he believes that's kind of like an influential power. And I think that is a very kind of important kind of thing that has been done by Professor Wang Qingjie, talking about the moral exemplar, right? And I think that is one way of moral education. And of course, there are a lot of kind of other ways of moral education of other people. But I think, I don't know whether your primary concern is about self-education, self kind of cultivation, right? And there is also this aspect. And perhaps we don't have time to go into detail because there are a lot of issues involving it. Because self-cultivation, people first the question you say, okay, this person is already morally bad. How can this person do the self-cultivation, right? If a person will do the self-cultivation, then this person will not be bad in the first place, right? But Zushi also has some kind of theory about that, because he thinks that you still have in his term is I think maybe close translation is the will, right? And people say, I just kind of because I'm born with impure chi, and that's why have to do the bad things, right? So it's not my responsibility. You're born with good chi, and you're a good person. I'm born with bad chi, I'm a bad person, right? So I cannot be blamed, and you cannot be praised either, right? But Zushi's view is that he thinks that if you have the will, 立志, right? So even if you're born with bad chi, you can still resist it and purify it. Right? So it's not like a deterministic, like in the sense that whenever you have the bad qi, then it determines you to be a bad person, right? Of course, if a person is born with a good qi, then of course, this person will be naturally good. But Zhuxi, and I think just like many other Neo-Confucians, really think that such kind of person, person is born with purely good qi without need any self-cultivation, hardly exists. Even, we are talking about a sage, like say, Xing and Yao, right? And from Zhuxi's point of view, they also made a mistake. And what's important about them is that they do not do it again, right? So, I will not go into the details about the different ways of doing moral cultivation, but I think the most important thing is that how can a morally bad person start to do self-cultivation, right? And that is, thing I try to say. But the moral cultivation by others, I think that is easy to understand, right? Yeah, I don't know, like whether, there are a lot of things that can be said about the cultivation, either cultivation by others or self-cultivation, right? But I think it is, some kind of general direction.
Thank you, Professor Huang.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we now really need to say good evening to everyone. We need to close this lecture. Thank you again for your talk, for the generosity in the discussion and taking the questions. And I hope to see you sometimes soon in person at this point.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
definitely. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was definitely because we are so close to each other. Our two departments shared. Since the pandemic, I think it's not officially over, but it's basically over, right?
We now
yeah,
can meet in person.
yeah, our two departments should do something together. Right?
Yeah.
So close to each other. All right, thank you so much for the invitation and for all those really good questions. Kind of get to the heart of things. Some questions that I really have trouble to answer. I need to think more carefully about this question. Thank you again. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Yeah. Right.